These are two of the Death Guard's grossest war machines, the Mythic Blight Hauler and the Four-Tide Bloat Drone. And the goal for this video is to find out, are these guys easy to paint, or has Nurgle's Touch raised the detail level to Demon Hood? The first thing I do is base spray the models with Halford's Grey Primer, and when dry, I then switch to a Death Guard green spray to base both the models. This usually covers 99% of all Death Guard base coats. To really show how decayed these guys were, I wanted to add rust onto parts of their armour and the fans of the Bloat Drone. So I took out a technical paint that I always forget that I have, Typhus Corrosion. It doesn't look like much when you first put it on, but give it a little while to dry and you'll see that it adds a textured corrosion look onto the model. Skin. It's not that I don't like painting you, but I just never seem to nail it down when it comes to painting your larger areas. But that's not going to stop me today, and I use Bugman's Glow to base all the skin parts, making sure not to miss the smaller parts near the guns. The Death Guard infantry loved their bronze, and the Demon engines were no different. Across both models there are a good few bronze parts spread out, like the Nurgle emblem on the front, armour parts and parts of the weapons, and they were painted with Balthazar gold. The other less popular metal, silver, Leadbelcher was used on parts like the spikes, the guns, the vents and the legs and tracks on the Blight Hauler. The Bloat Drone has a good few cables, so instead of having them one colour, I painted some with Corvus black and some with Mephiston red, just to add a little bit more colour into it. For the bones coming out through the armour, I used 2 thin layers of Wraith Bone, because it's a thin enough paint so it's easier to build it up with thinner layers. So far everything is going nicely. A few parts to tidy up here and there, but nothing hard yet, but there are still a good few details to get onto later on. With the base coats drying, I started to pick out the shades that I wanted to use, and I usually have a mixture of shade paints and contrast paints. I start off with Skeleton Horde, and this is one of my favourite contrast paints because it can cover a lot of base coats. In this case, I use it to shade in the green, the bronze, the cables and all the bones. For the skin, I go with the contrast paint Guilliman Flesh to add more depth into it. I give it a good even spread and make sure it doesn't pool up too much into the recesses. I had to go darker for the silver, and to go with that I went with Null and Oil all over the Leadbelcher base coats. With the shades dry, I go back to the skin and I layer on a few thin coats of Cadian Flesh Tone to brighten the skin back up. I tin it down with Lamb Medium and I build it up gradually, because it can be hard to get a solid look with Cadian Flesh Tone. While that was drying, it was time to start highlighting the armour, and this is where everything slows down a bit. I take out some Ogre and Camo and switch to a smaller brush, and I carefully edge highlight all the edges of the green armour. There are a lot of edges to cover on both models, so it can be quite tedious to get through it, but it'll be all worth it in the end. There's even a good few silver and bronze highlights to cover with Stormhold Silver and Runelord Brass. For the black cables, I usually go with a light grey, but I decided to try Dark Reaper out, and it turned out to be the right choice, because it kept the cables more darker but more visible when you looked at it from the right angle, if that sentence kinda makes sense. Ushopti Bone was then used to brighten up the edges of the bones. I returned to the skin now, and I started to layer on Kislev Flesh onto the highest edge parts. When dry, I heavily diluted some Reichland Flesh Shade and used it all over just to blend the colours in together. I knew the skin wasn't quite right yet, because I wanted some of the parts of the skin to look sore and like it was trying to burst out from the armour, and it wasn't there yet. So I took out some Carroburg Crimson and I added it into the recesses along the armour and some of the folds, and I think it did the job. At this point almost everything on the models were done, but there are some small details that will really finish these guys off. The first thing was their eyes, and to get that red shiny look, I based them both with Mephiston red, shaded them in with Blood Angel's red contrast paint, and then I added a small dot of Mephiston red into the centre, and then to finish it off, I gave it a light layer of gloss varnish just to make it shine. To truly finish off the skin, I used Averland Sunset on any boils that they had on their body. I gave them a shade of Cardboard Crimson, and then added a small bit of Averland Sunset back on the top just to make them look even more rotten. The last part then was, remember that Typhus corrosion I added in earlier? Well, I didn't forget about it, and it was time to add some simple rust effects over it. I started off with a light dry brush of Rise of Rust over the corroded parts. The key here is to let the dry brush gradually add more on, instead of trying to get it all on in one quick go. Then when it was dry, I did the same thing but with Stormhost Silver this time, and just tried to hit the very edges. You only want a small amount of paint to go on. Finally, to tone it down a bit, I used some Nuln Oil to make it blend in nicely. At the start of this video, I said my goal was to find out how hard it was to paint these guys. And well, when all the painting parts are broken down into the steps I just did, honestly, I flew through painting these guys. The base coat spray of Death Guard Green is a massive time saver, and there are really only 4 main colours on these guys. Green, bronze, silver and the skin colour. And then there's a little bit of red and bone sprinkled in. The highlighting was the most time consuming because the armour has a lot of edges, and the skin took me quite a while because it was down to me doing a lot of back and forth on what way to paint it. But overall, there are a lot more higher detailed models out there, and to give these guys a difficulty rating, I'd say they'd be in the lower middle range, maybe a 4 out of 10. But if you guys like this video, make sure to hit the like button, leave a comment below and subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you guys in the next video.